So this is going to be one of my more personal videos where I open up and talk about something which I've dreaded discussing for a very long time. It's something very personal that I need to get off my chest at some point, and I've always felt uneasy discussing because I've been afraid of this. I've been afraid of this word for a very long time. Due to the experiences I've had, and due to the life that I've lived, and due to the way I've been coached and socialized, I've been conditioned to avoid and distance myself from this word and from its connotations and what it means. And even now, I hesitate to use this word, especially when describing myself. I don't like the things that it's commonly associated with. I don't associate with the word and with the people who identify as this particular word. But nonetheless, I have a history with it. It has a history with me, and it's followed me around since my earliest days like a specter, like a shadow that never really disappears. There have been many instances, there have been many experiences I've had throughout my life where people, either acquaintances or close friends or adults, have come up to me in a moment of confidence, and each time they've said the same thing. They've said, "Can I ask you a question?" Or, "Excuse me, is it all right if I ask you a personal question?" And each time, it's happened often enough that I know what they're going to ask before they ask it, because there's only one question that they ever ask, and it's, do you have Aspergers? Are you autistic? So obviously, I like to think of myself as perfectly functional in the manner that I don't usually act in a way, at least not in public to most people, in a way that warrants negative attention, or in a manner that indicates that I'm handicapped in one way or another. But obviously, I'm not completely normal. You know, I wouldn't have the views about myself, about life, about death, and the state of the world and humanity if I were a perfectly ordinary human being. I wouldn't have the experiences that I contend with commonly if I had a perfectly functional human brain. But alas, I'm an imperfect human. My lived experience is not the same as other people's. I don't frankly know what kind of person I am. People will look at me, the way I talk and how I present myself, and they'll come to a snap judgment about my neurotypology. But I reject the word autistic. I don't even like the word Asperger's. And I fucking hate the word Aspie or autist. I feel viscerally sick when I even come across those words. And I'm going to ban anybody who uses it when describing me, because that word is not for me. I reject it 100%. All I can say is, looking back, to give a summary conclusion, what kind of person I am. If I'm not autistic, then what am I? I'm certainly not normal. All I can say is I'm me. I'm a bit weird. I'm a bit awkward. I'm the way I am. But I don't identify. I don't consciously identify. I don't choose to identify as this particular word, because that word is more or less, it's kind of a label. It's sort of an arbitrary bracket we give to people whose brains don't form in the expected way. People who stand out in one way or another in terms of how they behave and how they live their lives in this way and that. It's a category which I would say I don't completely fit within either. And like all labels, labels are for soup cans. They're not for people, you know? You can't really decide what kind of person another one is by assigning an arbitrary label like that to one person, because you don't know the full story. You don't know what their internal thought process is like. You don't know what kind of early upbringing they've had. But people like to approximate things with guesses. People like to generalize. And the usage of words like autism, autistic, Aspergers is one such example. So anyway, now that I've gotten that out of the way, I'm going to talk about my early life history with this troublesome word, what it's meant for me, and also why I reject it. So I have fragmentary recollections of my early childhood. Like I would say my earliest kind of lucid memories begin sort of when I'm 6 to 8 years old and past that point. So I don't remember much of what life was like in my early childhood. However, there are plenty of video recordings from my mum's home personal camcorder, her Panasonic camcorder, which was one of the most advanced home video camcorders around back in the mid to late 90s. A lot of these videos, which do feature me in my very early childhood at the ages from 3 to 6, and there are lots of observations that can be made about me and the way I was back then, which give some kind of insight as to what kind of person I was. And, well, one can come to conclusions in some way as to what this meant. So obviously, from an early age, I wasn't completely normal. I didn't learn to speak my first words until I was 3 years old. So I had a delayed onset of speech. I was incredibly hyperactive. In a lot of the home video recordings I saw of me, obviously I was full of energy and running around here and there, which in itself is not unusual, because most little boys and most little girls are quite like that when they first learn to walk. There's all this energy, this boundless energy, and more energy than they even know what to do with. They're restless, they can't sit down. But with me, it was more than that. There were things going on beyond that. So in my case, I was so hyperactive, I had so much energy, so much emotional overload, that I wouldn't just run around. I had a tendency to flap my hands like this, and I would pull strange faces. I think in jargon, in psychological circles regarding symptoms of ASD, I think this is what's known as stimming. Stimming, from what I understand, it's a form of repetitive compulsive behavior that's done consciously or otherwise in order to regulate intense emotions that occur within the brain. You see, with many people who are autistic, there's a huge overlap between ASD and another comorbid condition known as ADHD or ADD. A lot of the time you'll find that people who are autistic, they tend to have symptoms of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, as well. And what brain scans have shown with people who suffer from ADHD is that there's a region of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with emotional regulation, long-term planning, and impulse control. And what the scans tend to show is that the prefrontal cortex is reduced or shrunk in people who have ADHD, which explains in large part why they're incredibly hyperactive and restless, why they act first and think later, why a lot of them make impulsive or reckless decisions. And I certainly had a lot of elements of this. And that was just one example. Another thing about me is that I've never been able to go to sleep. It's just, I've suffered insomnia my entire life. And even now, I've reached the stage where I've given up trying to go to bed at a specific time because my brain finds it incredibly easy to self-stimulate. You see, whenever I experience emotions at a very intense emotions, things like cortisol or adrenaline, it becomes nigh on impossible for me to calm down. I need time for the energy to dissipate. And it's not easy to dissipate. And if I'm lying in bed and that same process of self-stimulation happens, usually while I'm daydreaming or while my brain happens upon an interesting thought, an interesting possible scenario, perhaps an idea for a new song or a story that hasn't been written, or perhaps a distant memory from my early childhood which is being revisited. It takes ages for that to calm down, and it makes it impossible for me to go into rest mode because there's no off switch up here. There never was for me. So that's another thing. That's pretty much the kind of child that I was. I found it very difficult to make friends growing up because I had a very narrow range of obsessive interests. I'm trying to think, what kind of things was I interested in growing up? Well, Pokemon, I absolutely loved Pokemon. I mean, even now I still have a soft spot for Pokemon. Maybe the first 3 generations, and the 4th, I don't really recognize the rest. You know, because I grew up with Ruby and Sapphire. What else? Oh yeah, Hornby, model trains. Yeah, I was absolutely enthralled, fascinated with those model trains, and they were so much fun to stare at. I got into a lot of fights with the other boys in primary school because they were fun. I mean, I don't remember whether I won or lost any, but that's just the kind of person I was. I guess that's kind of typical for a lot of young boys, but I kept getting sent inside, and well, the teachers kept having to have words with me. But obviously, I had some degree of impaired functionality in my early childhood. It took me ages to find a school where I really fit in, because I kept getting moved around I must have been moved around 4 or 5 different schools in my early childhood. The very first primary school I went to, the teachers were pretty stubborn and adamant that I was a troubled child and I wouldn't fit in. They believed that I was autistic. They hired a psychologist. They made observations about my behavior, and you got to understand that this was the late 90s. Now, in the late 90s, this was around the time of the Wakefield debacle, the Wakefield study, which talked about the MMR vaccination. And the word autism and autistic spectrum disorder, and I think Aspergers, but the two were sort of, they were sort of synonymous. The prognosis was a bit grim for both of those words because autism was just beginning to enter the public lexicon. As far as most people were concerned, autism was widely regarded as a disorder, and the outlook was not good. Like, if you had a child with autism, they would struggle for the rest of their life. They would never make friends. They would have difficulties with social cues like eye contact and empathy. At best, they would live solitary, unfulfilling lives where they would be in need of assistance, and at worst, they'd be cold or evil psychopathic killers. I can't think of any particular examples, but probably, I think 1999 was at the time of the Columbine mass shootings. Now, I don't know for sure whether there was an association made with autism and the school shooters at the time, but I think that's what the prevailing mind was about conditions like autism. So it wasn't exactly a happy outlook. And my mother was horrified. She could not accept this. As far as she was concerned, obviously something wasn't quite right with me but she would not tolerate me being diagnosed with autism, because if it were true, if I did have that exact condition, then it was game over. Then my life would basically have been over there and then. So she did the best she could to prove them wrong. And what she ended up doing was she hired a child psychologist. Well, she was an adult, but she studied children. That's why, child psychologist. Thought I'd make that clear. By the name of Lynn Fry. Now, Lynn Fry was something of an expert in her field. She'd worked with feral children before. Now, this Lynn Fry woman, what she did was she made observations about me in class, and she came to a different conclusion to what the school did. What she believed I had was what she referred to as a speech and language auditory processing disorder. As far as she was concerned, I was bright, intelligent. Those are her words, not mine. I don't really identify as bright or intelligent either. I had difficulty understanding language and how to communicate effectively, but I was not autistic. And this gave my mother the hope that as long as I'd been raised and coached and tutored effectively in the art of social etiquette, how to behave in certain situations, what to say, what not to say, and how to say it, then I could come out a perfectly rational, sober-minded, healthy young boy, and I could live a fulfilling and meaningful life. And I would escape the taboo of being diagnosed as autistic. That's what my mother wanted. So after that diagnosis, we're getting into when I was at the ages of 7 to 11 years old. So my, no longer my early childhood, but my mid-childhood. I went to a special school in Wimbledon, London, where I was surrounded with other people who were socially impaired in one way or another. I have a lot of positive memories from that time period because, well, I never got to experience social ostracism back then because we were all a bit different. We were all a bit quirky. I felt like a normal kid back then, and that was probably the last time I would ever feel secure and comfortable about myself and my personality quirks. Also, I was still very much a child back then, and I didn't really have any concept of how different or how strange I was until later, when I would enter a real school, an actual primary school and a state school where I was surrounded by normal, ordinary people. It was then when I was 11 going on 12 that I entered my first, actually no, it was technically my second proper school. It was a state school where I was surrounded by ordinary local people. And that's where my really formative life experiences unfolded. It was growing up here. I think I spent 7 or 8 years at secondary school where I possibly learned more about myself there than I did anywhere else. Possibly anywhere before or after. Actually, now I say that, that's debatable, but that was where my real formative experiences took place. Now, obviously, I acted in ways that made me stand out at school. I didn't have an easy time, especially from years 7 to 9. So, bullying. I wasn't bullied. When people think of bullying, when people imagine bullying, what they tend to think of is very, very one-dimensional. Usually what they think of is big, burly gangs of tall kids bundling a scruffy, weak kid with glasses into a gym locker or shoving his face in the toilet and flushing it. None of that ever happened with me, right? Because, first of all, I was one of the tallest kids in my entire year. So it wouldn't have been easy to pick a fight with me. But I did get a lot of, people did look at me funny. People did sometimes talk to me as though I was a bit awkward, and I did have a lot of trouble making friends. Whenever we were having activities that involved grouping up into partners, a lot of the time I would find that I was one of the last children to find a partner or a group, because I just wasn't naturally inclined to form bonds and talk with other people. If I did chat with other people in class, or if I partnered up with them, it was usually out of convenience, by virtue of the fact that they were next to me. We were both in the same class, and we had to bond together for this purpose or that. But I didn't have my own sort of coterie. I never had my own sort of social clique to hang out with, and I never spent any time in the school playground, because the school playground was a scary place. I just didn't know what to do there. I didn't feel comfortable at all. Most of lunch and during recess, playground time. What was it called? Oh, I'll just call it recess. Most of the time back then, I would spend in the school library reading through books. It was a lot more relaxing, and it was a relief knowing that I wasn't forced to take part in these bizarre social rituals where I had to sort of belong to a gang and sort of nod my head along and follow along with what other people have always said. I'm trying to think. Around this time, yes. So in my teens, this was when people would start talking about girls, the opposite sex, sexual intercourse and all that. And I did start having feelings for the opposite sex in my mid-teens, but I didn't have any experience with women until a decade later, because, well, it's not easy talking to girls, because women and females by nature they're more socially gregarious. They pick up on social nuances and rules of social etiquette a lot more easily than boys. I've heard it been said that there are plenty of women who have symptoms of Aspergers and autism, but the symptoms do not present themselves as easily, and it's way harder to spot. A lot of the time, I've seen plenty of YouTube videos of girls who are open about their ASD diagnosis, and a lot of the time, I have to say, I wouldn't have even picked up on it had they not said so, because for the most part, they don't seem to engage in all the classical stereotypical behaviors that are commonly associated with autism. Things like obsessive niche interests, talking in a manner that stands out, like having a flat affect or a monotone, or poor eye contact. It's difficult for me in my position to qualitatively, definitively say whether they have an easier or a harder time growing up with this condition. All I can speak about with authority is my own lived experience. But yeah, the mid-teens of my life were pretty rough. Though I would say that by the time I was 15 and going on to my late teens, I think people were beginning to get a bit more accepting and tolerant towards me. I was a bit of a weirdo. I had my eccentricities. I had my idiosyncrasies. But people were beginning to accept me. I'd cemented my reputation as the class clown. A lot of the times I would raise my hand in class. They would ask, and the teacher would ask for my input, and I'd try and crack a joke here or there. But it's difficult to say whether I was funny or whether people laughed out of a mixture of politeness or pity. It's difficult for me to say. Another thing I remembered is whenever we would engage in activities in class that involves reading, especially reading from a textbook, I was always the first one to volunteer because I've always loved reading out loud. I don't feel embarrassed at all. I've never felt embarrassed or uncomfortable giving a speech in front of many people because I see it as an art, as a performance. When I was 16 once, I was so outraged by the state of our school toilets, I decided that something had to be done. So I put on a school presentation about how terrible our toilets were. Everyone found it hilarious and everyone congratulated me over that, telling me how brave I was. But I didn't find it, frightening. I found it exciting. It's for this very reason that when my father passed away, obviously I was going to have to be the one to give the eulogy speech. And I didn't break into tears. My throat didn't get caught up or dry. I didn't want to cry at any point because it was too easy. Giving a speech in front of an audience, I don't see it as frightening or harrowing. Stage fright, I've never understood that. I've always had this compulsion to act or perform in front of other people. I yearn for the possibility to do things like that. I don't know if that's something that's commonly associated with autism. Maybe it's to do with hyperactivity. But that's another facet of my personality. Now, fast forward a couple more years. When I left my secondary school and my sixth form, there was a very sharp transition between leaving my school, graduating from my secondary school and sixth form, to going to university. It's around this point, between the ages of 18 to 20, that's when my mental health started to take a nosedive. I said earlier that I learned more about myself and about the world when I was growing up in secondary school, but actually, now that I look back, that's not true. I'd say it was this point where I actually began to learn just how not normal I was, and just how not normal the world is, how not normal everything is. I began to learn that I was actually even lonelier than I previously imagined. My entire life, I'd been raised to talk and act in a certain way, to always take the initiative to be friendly with other people, even when the opportunity presents itself. But now that I was at university, I found that people were self-segregating in their own dormitories. They were going back home each weekend to visit their parents. At the little gap between seminars or lectures at school, people would just sit stiff and quiet and never say a word to each other. They would communicate privately about about this or that and the work they were doing, but they would never let me involved in the conversation. It's like they were all conversing through telepathy or something. There were these fraternities and societies, but they were too heavily social. And I've said earlier that I never really found my coterie or a sort of group that I belong to, and I've never been a group person. You see, I'm the kind of person, I always have been, the kind of person who prefers smaller, one-on-one, intimate relationships with other people, rather than being part of a faceless, anonymous collective. But university wasn't like that. University is a scary place if you exhibit signs of autism, because you're surrounded by hundreds of people each day on a campus. If you make friends with one person, by the next day you're just as likely to forget their names and lose track of them for all time, which is what happened with me, in spite of the fact that we had social media around this time. I felt lonelier at university than I ever did before in my life. And even though my early to mid-teens were some of the more brutal years of my life, I would say compared to then, my mental health was a lot better. I didn't feel demoralized, lonely, and miserable, and I didn't start having, suicidal, dark thoughts until I started going to university, and I realized this is what everyone does. They all, without exception, people live to drink lots of alcohol, they go to clubs, they listen to loud, obnoxious, shitty music, they smoke outside, they sometimes study. Well, I wasn't exactly a bright spark either. I didn't really enjoy studying, and I'd already fallen out of love with my degree and any sense of being an academic in my early years of being of university anyhow. But I just didn't feel like I fit in anywhere in university. And this in part was what inspired me while I was there to consult the mental health and psychology clinic which existed on site, because for a long time I wanted to settle the matter as to whether I was or was not autistic. And I thought a psychiatric evaluation could finally put my fears at rest. See, my thinking was, at the time, if I get tested and if I do get a confirmed diagnosis of autism, then it would explain everything. It would explain why I felt so lonely, why I've always felt so distant and strange and estranged from other people and detached from what goes on in the world. It would give me answers. It would give me closure. So I did that. I enrolled, I took part in a study. They studied and evaluated me psychologically, and they came to the conclusion that I'd have to dig out the old file and reread it again to see what they said exactly. But they said I exhibited symptoms of what they called borderline Aspergers syndrome. They said I had symptoms that are associated with autism, with Asperger's. I think they're sort of, they don't use the word Asperger's anymore. Now they sort of lumped it in with ASD, because they now describe autism as a spectrum rather than a classic one-size-fits-all diagnosis. And they don't use the word Asperger's anymore because apparently the guy who studied it and gave his name to it, apparently he was a Nazi. And he conducted experiments on children in the Holocaust. So I hear. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. So, well, I showed this diagnosis to my mother, and, well, she was supportive. She was proud for me because she knew, obviously, she could see things from my perspective. She wanted what was, in her mind, she wanted what was best for me. She wanted me to live a fulfilling and meaningful life, and I wanted answers about who I was. So now that I had this, I thought, well, now I'm sort of autistic, so this means I need to find other autistic people. I need to find other people who are like myself, and then I'll finally have what I've always yearned for. I'll have my own collective, my own coterie. And while I was in university, this was around my second year, I did meet several people who actually had a confirmed diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder. Many of them picked up on my mannerisms and came to that conclusion rather quickly. So it all seemed like it was going well, but over time I started to become disillusioned and demoralized, because the more time I spent around these Aspies or autistic people, as they so unabashedly self-identified as such, the more time I spent with them, the less I found I had in common with any of them. I found many instances of their behavior to be quite vulgar and in many cases repulsive. A lot of these people, they would F and blind constantly like there was nothing wrong with it. They would use vulgar language. They would go out drinking every weekend, well, every night, like there was nothing wrong with it. And they expected me to fall in with that kind of behavior. And by nature, many of them were, well, they didn't seem to exhibit any of the characteristics, any of the difficulties that I'd had. They had their own friends. They had a social life, a very vibrant and active social life. It had flipped my understanding of who I was and what autism was and what I believe was wrong with me. It had flipped my understanding of the world upside down to the point where I no longer knew who I was. I didn't know what they were. I didn't know what it meant to be autistic or to have Asperger's. And it made me realize that after some reflection and after some introspection and careful self-study, I realized I could not call myself autistic, and I would choose no longer to identify with the word Asperger's, because it didn't give me the answers I was looking for. It didn't explain who I was. It didn't explain why I was different. It didn't explain why I had such an aversion to social activities, why I found all this uncomfortable and distasteful. It didn't give me the answers I wanted. And to this day, that is why, even now, I continue to distance myself from these two words. I don't identify consciously as having autism or Asperger's. On the one hand, I recognize that there are structural abnormalities in my brain. Obviously, things are not quite right up here. I must have been born with some form of mutations and some form of mutational load, which has led to a series of disorders in my brain, which have led to compulsions like hyperactivity, having narrow, obsessive, niche interests, having an aversion to taking part in social activities, having strong, rigid, and bordering on inflexible views on what I consider right and improper, or tasteful and distasteful, a sense of discretion as for who I like to hang around with and who I don't like to hang around with. It's also led to me having the political and views on society and politics that I have now over time. But on the other hand, I don't claim this word. This word does not explain who I am. I reject it. I don't fall in line with that kind of word. I am who I am. I'm an individual. I don't think that a word exists in the clinical literature to describe what it is that I have, what kind of personality, what kind of neurotype I have. All I know is that I'm different, I'm weird. I'll probably never find the answer. But that's the sum total of my 30 years life experience of me trying to find out the answers as to what kind of person I am. Now, I would love to broaden this topic and talk a little more about this, but I'll have to do that in a part 2. And I'm going to talk about some of the many the commonly associated behavioral aspects of people who are diagnosed with autism, people who have a confirmed diagnosis have. I'm going to talk about what I have in common with them and what I don't, and what kinds of, what this has led to in terms of my personal experiences of living and not. So stick around for part 2, because there's more to come. Anyway, I'll see you later.